Hello, everyone, and welcome to another week with Chef AJ. This time, of course, we are continuing with the 8-week series, Surviving the Holidays. And of course, we all need that. I was just reading Chef AJ's book and process because I'm making the disappearing lasagna tomorrow. So today we have, of course, the one and only Chef AJ, and we also have an just amazing guest, Dr. Alan Goldhamer from Santa Rosa, California, founder and director of True North. And this is going to be an excellent webinar. Of course, all of you will get a replay tomorrow, and you will be able to watch it at your convenience as many times as you'd like. So without further ado, again, my name is Gustavo Tolosa. I'm here in Dallas. How are you doing tonight, Chef AJ in Los Angeles?
I'm doing great, Gustavo. We're actually, right after this is over, we're actually having our Thanksgiving dinner because we have a compliant, SOS-free potluck the day before because so many people have to go eat crap with their families, so we sort of set the stage to show them it doesn't have to be that way.
That's right. Thank you. Thank you. Would you mind saying a few words about Dr. Goldhamer and introducing him?
Absolutely. So it's a pleasure, a privilege, and an honor to interview my mentor, a person that's made a profound difference in my life. When I met him, I was fat and sick, and now I'm not anymore, 50 pounds less 5 years later after meeting him. He is none other than the co-author of probably the best book ever written since the Bible, The Pleasure Trap with Dr. Doug Lisle, another brilliant scholar who is going to grace us with his presence in a few short weeks. He's the co-founder, along with his wife, Dr. Jennifer Morano, of True North Health Center in Santa Rosa, California, where everyone should go in general, but people that struggle with food addiction in particular should go. And he, I think, knows more about this topic than probably any other person on earth because he has eaten this way for 40 years without having ever been overweight or ever been sick, just because it's the healthiest, safest, sanest way to eat. So please welcome Dr. Alan Goldhamer.
Thank you, AJ.
Yeah. So this is a tough subject for people, huh? Getting the food right, huh? You've worked with about, what, 30,000 people now in 30 years?
Yeah, we've worked with a lot of people. At least 15,000 that have been through our fasting protocol, and probably an equal number that have done, outpatient and feeding programs. So yeah, there probably is close to 30,000 people.
Wow, that's amazing. That's like 15 times more than I've worked with. So congratulations. And this seems to be a difficult situation for them, right? I mean, it's not easy.
Well, the holidays are a particularly difficult time of year. Many patients that manage to do well all year long oftentimes find once they hit this magic holiday season get into a great deal of difficulty. Starting with Thanksgiving and going through the Christmas holidays and into New Year, the average person, I believe, gains somewhere around 8 pounds of fat between Thanksgiving and New Year's, and then spends the rest of the year trying to lose about 5 of it,
right,
accumulating several pounds net gain as the years go by until eventually chronic degenerative disease debilitates them in one form or another. So the holidays, to me, represent perhaps the most dangerous time of year. It's a combination of factors, I think. Sometimes people think it's a license to indulge. There's a lot of stress sometimes being around family members. Alcohol, I think, plays a significant role, both in terms of stressing people out and also disinhibiting them. So everything combined, it's just a very, very difficult, I think, high stress and high likelihood of variation in difficulty. The good news is that by the time people reach New Year's, they're often fat and sick and miserable, and so they're ready to start doing the right thing with the New Year's start. I found, though, that if people can escape the holiday madness, start off the New Year right, then when everybody else is trying to do what they're doing all the time, there seems to be a little bit more support for it. So.
Right. You mentioned that tomorrow, Thanksgiving, is a pivotal day where many people will relapse and spend, till the end of the year on probably one continuous binge of food and alcohol, non-compliant food. And like you said, the weight that is gained during that period, from what I've read, is generally not taken off, if at all. I would argue that it might have even started sooner at Halloween.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess that the intense celebration of that pagan holiday with its candy feasting probably isn't a very good start for the
Right.
to the
So
answer.
the people at True North, they're safe from these forces, right? The hidden forces that undermine health and happiness, whether they're fasting or free feeding. If they're in your walls, they're pretty safe.
Well, they're pretty much safe any place that health-promoting foods are available and temptations are avoided. Most people are not going out of their way to disrupt their programs. What's happening is they're getting into environments where that's the expected behavior, the social norm, and the temptation is kind of overwhelming. So I think one of the keys is trying to create safe environments wherever you are, at home, at work, so that you don't have these things pulling at you, because they are very powerful forces. People underestimate just how powerful the dietary pleasure trap actually is.
Right. Now, I'm sure that most people are familiar with you and your work, but in case there's someone not, could you just briefly explain what the dietary pleasure trap is?
Well, the theory is that the dopamine, which is the neurochemical in the brain associated with pleasure, can be artificially stimulated. It can be artificially stimulated with things like drugs. It can be artificially stimulated with promiscuous sexual behavior, gambling behavior. Lots of things can stimulate dopamine production in the brain. And one of those things are the chemicals that are commonly added to food, things like oil, salt, and sugar. So we talk about an SOS-free diet because SOS stands for the international symbol of danger, but it also stands for sugar, including refined carbohydrates, oil, and salt. So by designing a diet that is based on plant foods, whole plant foods preferably, and that doesn't have these chemicals added to the whole plant foods, you end up with a diet that not only has the vitamins, minerals, fiber, protein, etc. that you need, but avoids the likelihood of artificially stimulating that dopamine cascade, avoids the dietary distinction, allows people to achieve and maintain optimum weight and health. The challenge is that we live in a world that's really designed to make us fat, sick, and miserable. So everywhere people go, people are giving them what they want, not what they need. And what they want is pleasure.
Right.
And what they need is a strategy for having a healthy, happy life that doesn't involve them being an addict. And it's not easy in our society today.
No, and especially not in holiday season where not only are the food pushers out in full force, but food is out in full force everywhere you go. Like you talked about the environment, it's everywhere.
I had a patient tell me they were very distressed about the recent elections because their candidate, the candidate that they wanted to win didn't win and a different candidate won. And so that led them to eating off the diet. They ate chocolate and got into it.
I heard the same thing in our program.
Yeah, and I was explaining to them that, I understand their feelings, but what they should have done is taken that chocolate and mailed it to the candidate that they didn't like and asked them to eat it. Right. Because, since they're causing them stress, why should they suffer? Make the person that's causing the problem suffer.
Right.
Send them to work.
Absolutely, absolutely. But that seems to be a universal response to stress, is seeking these foods that cause us to achieve more pleasure more quickly.
Well, they're seeking pleasure. They're seeking relief from pain, psychological pain, physical pain, whatever it is. And one of the ways you can reliably induce a pleasure response is to take drugs, engage in promiscuous sexual behavior, or eat foods that have a highly concentrated caloric densities from chemicals that are added to it. And it does work. It just doesn't lead to health and happiness.
Right.
It does lead to induction of pleasure, though.
Our ancestors probably had lots of pain in their life, but they didn't have these foods and drink to medicate with. So what did they do?
Well, I think that you're correct that the ability to indulge in many of the things that we have, they didn't engage in. They would have if they could have, but they didn't. And as a consequence, they probably had different consequences in their life as a result of that.
Right.
Like, if you see in non-industrialized countries, when they introduce things like television and they start bringing in KFC, you see there's a cascade of behavior that pretty much mimics what happens here. I don't think that we're weak as a people, and I don't think non-industrialized countries are necessarily any stronger. The reality is that temptation can only become overcome by consciousness. Right. And so, the reality is the default is, indulge in short-term pleasure-seeking, self-indulgent behavior whenever possible. I think in the past, though, it was rare to be able to get access to these things, except perhaps in holidays or special treats. And that's really where a lot of this holiday festive feeding came in. And perhaps back then, if somebody indulged in some kind of festive treat, a few times a year, perhaps the consequences would have been limited. The problem is now, of course, we have a holiday every day, and then come the real holidays, we have to top even that, and so it gets almost to be ridiculous.
Right. Well, how much pleasure are we talking about, Dr. Goldhamer? So if somebody's following the Ultimate Weight Loss Program or the Health Promoting Diet taught at True North, is pretty much the same program, and they decide to indulge, whether it's because they actually plan to and want to, or they relapse, how much pleasure are they getting versus the amount of pain and suffering that it's going to cause them?
Well, actually, it depends. You know, some people are young and healthy and have very strong constitutions and have relatively limited short-term consequences from their behaviors. Other people are older, maybe they have accumulated damage, or perhaps they have conditions, for example, autoimmune disease, where they're more vulnerable to the effects of these problems. And so, in a way, I almost think they have a blessing, because if you have a condition that prevents you from engaging in short-term pleasure-seeking self-indulgent behavior without having pain as a consequence, you're more inclined to want to do it. If you have those conditions, you tend not to want to do it because the immediate pain is such a great price. And so sometimes those people with those conditions actually in the long run seem to do quite well because they get short-term consequences of their behavior, so they don't have to get the long-term consequences of the people that kind of fool themselves into thinking they're getting away with it.
Mm-hmm. What advice would you give people before going off plan tomorrow, or is there something you could say to them that might make a difference?
Well, I think one of the things that people want to remember when they're engaging in holiday behaviors, they want good feelings. And some of those good feelings comes from the social consequence of interacting, hopefully, with people they like and love. And they don't necessarily have to engage in short-term pleasure-seeking, self-indulgent behavior to get a bunch of good feelings. And in fact, many patients find that if they come up with a strategy where they can eat healthy foods and still participate socially with their friends and relatives, they can actually not only have a good time, as good a time as they would have if they had been overloading themselves with self-indulgent behaviors or alcohol, but then they actually can have a good time the next day and the next week, and they don't have to actually pay that price. I don't think there's anything about healthy eating that prevents you from enjoying the holidays. I know at True North, we certainly have lots of wonderful times without having to compromise on the health habits. Now, it may be possible, though, to have something maybe you don't have frequently. It still may be health promoting, but it's different. It's an unusual thing, or something that you associate with holidays. For example, things like wild rice, which are perfectly health promoting, but are perhaps something that people aren't necessarily engaging in every day. Those dishes, maybe combining that with other things that perhaps, again, are perfectly health promoting, but are not maybe the typical fare, the roasted chestnut, the whatever it is that they're going to do.
Cranberry sauce, perhaps.
Exactly. And so, trying to pick out things that might be, special to them, but that don't necessarily have health compromising consequences may still more or less approximate the holiday theme. I know Ramses baked some sweet yam pies, which essentially are yams and cinnamon and a little bit of orange juice. Certainly nothing to cause people to get into trouble, but they have kind of the feel of the holiday theme. And for a lot of people, that's plenty in order for them to enjoy their holiday.
But unfortunately, most people don't have a Chef Ramses Bravo making their pies, and they're going to be in a place.
That's why it's important to have good cookbooks that have those recipes in there.
Right, like for instance, this one that just recently came out, written by
our own Kathy, is fabulous.
Excellent. And if you want a dessert, boy, her carrot cake, her pumpkin pie squares, absolutely incredible. But our people, Dr. Goldhamer, are probably going to go even places where not only are they not vegan, but they're certainly not going to be Kathy or Ramses' recipe. Right. And the people are going to tell them to take one bite because it was made just for them. And after all, one bite can't hurt.
So one thing that's a good thing to do is, always try to and offer to bring dishes when you go so that there'll at least be something edible there. It's not a bad strategy to eat before you go. So when you are there, you can socialize, push some food around in your plate, but not have to be hungry with no choices available. So being satiated before you go, taking food with you, even if you do accept the graciousness of your host, a lot of times they won't really be able to tell what you are eating. And so you can do it hopefully without offending people too much. Same kind of thing with alcohol. You can have your glass of apple juice or something, and nobody, unless they're actually smelling your glass, will know that you're not partaking in the health compromising, disease destroying consequences of consuming alcohol with all of its consequences. You don't necessarily have to rub it in their face.
Right. But
you're kind of already doing that, particularly if you've been doing this program for a while, because you're thin enough or healthy enough that it kind of annoys them you just walking in the room.
Right. Well, so many of the people, I hear them say, but I don't want to offend them, and it breaks my heart. It will hurt their feelings if I don't eat their crap food. I don't understand that personally. You took a cooking class at my house. If you didn't want to eat anything, you just said no. You just didn't eat it. You weren't worried about hurting my feelings.
Yeah, I think, people want to fit in. They want to go along. They want to get along. That's why I like Dr. Lyle's advice in our book, The Pleasure Trap, because he talks about how you can go along and get along without making your issues somebody else's issues. It is a challenge, though, because really it's not just that they want you to partake in their self-indulgent behavioral induced foods, but they're also feeling a little self-conscious, frankly, that if you're not drinking, if you're not eating, then perhaps you're passing judgment on them. So if you follow Dr. Lyle's strategies, a lot of times you can fool them into thinking that you're really not passing judgment on them, you're not really concerned about their thing, that you're doing it for whatever limitations you have, that you appreciate, admire, and respect everything they do and they've done. And frankly, if you can't figure out a strategy around that, that may say more about the people you're interacting with than it does about you.
They say the best defense is a good offense, and I would hope that people would be inspired to hear what you have to say and just do the tricks we've taught them, pre-eat, bring their own food, and not get into trouble tomorrow. But should they get into trouble, what's the best and quickest way to recover from a relapse or a dietary indiscretion?
Right. Going back to like the intermittent fasting models of 5 and 2, where a couple days a week you limit yourself to raw fruit and salad materials, as preferably large amounts of salad materials, is a really good kind of recovery way. So you're still eating, you're getting about 600 calories of food in, your bowels are still moving, everything's working fine, but you're eating large volumes of salad, fresh fruit. These foods tend to be less stimulating. It allows the body to recalibrate a little bit, and you do that for a day or two until you feel back in control. The only danger to that type of advice is that people think, well, I'm going to indulge, but I'll make up for it by doing some type of intermittent fasting behavior. I don't think that's a particularly good way of going into it. I think a better strategy would be to say, I'm going to do my very best to eat as much healthy food as possible. If I do choose to indulge in something, I'm going to make the contest to see how little of that I can indulge in, still go along, get along, whatever, but without having to actually compromise myself so I don't have to feel miserable the next day. And sometimes that degree of success, that can be a degree of success as well, even if people do choose to eat things they don't normally indulge in. There are some things, though, that are worse than others, and I would really caution about alcohol, because alcohol has a real disinhibiting factor. It's not just the 7 calories per gram liver compromising, fat inducing consequences. It's also the effect it has on your thinking. And so a lot of times under the influence of alcohol, people will disengage and engage in behaviors they wouldn't normally do. So even if you're going to eat something you shouldn't eat, try to do it fully conscious, pay attention. A lot of times this can be a really good learning experience too, because you find out that the amount of pleasure you get really isn't enough to justify the price that you're paying. And people oftentimes have an inflated view of how valuable they think indulging in these behaviors is going to be.
Yeah. How long do you think it takes after a relapse for our food to start tasting good again?
Well, that depends on the person. I can't tell you from personal experience, because I have, it's been many decades since I've had the opportunity to really test it personally. But I can tell you from what patients tell me is that for many people, it's literally a day or two on salad and fruit material before things start to come back. But for other people, it can be a little bit more of a problem. And taste and adaptation can take longer to recover. I don't know at this point how to quantify that, or how to tell who's going to take a long time and who's going to take a short time. But,
we have some.
You have to go back on simple whole foods long enough until they start to taste good again, however long that takes.
Right. Well, one of the reasons I'm afraid to relapse, well, there's 2 reasons. One is because anytime I even think about it, you either manifest in person or call me, and that's happened twice. But the other reason is because I enjoy my food so much then I'm afraid to even eat a rich date nut dessert because then I don't enjoy my food, and I like being able to enjoy my food.
You know, that's really a very good point, is that you might get a little bit of short-term artificial drug-like stimulation from eating that whatever decadent piece of whatever. But then you're going to lose some of the enjoyment for days or weeks afterwards as a consequence of the taste irritation that occurs. And particularly for an addict, it's a problem. You know, if you ask an alcoholic how long do they have to stop drinking before they're not thinking about drinking again, you know, that's going to vary, just like it is going to be with food. Some people, frankly, can have an indulgence and not think about it again and not worry about it. And for them, it may not be a problem, just like somebody can have a drink and not necessarily find themselves, you know, unable to talk or move, waking up somewhere. But for alcoholics, they know having one is asking for trouble. And for food addicts, they also know, you know, they can't really do very much indulgence before they're getting into trouble.
Yeah.
And
you know, it's interesting because what I've been hearing from people is they're struggling with these outside eating situations tomorrow because they have a specific diet. They're telling their host in advance and offering to bring food, and hosts are saying, I don't understand, you can't just eat it this once, it's Thanksgiving. People wouldn't say to an alcoholic, you mean you can't just have a drink today, it's Thanksgiving? Why do people take food addiction so less seriously than drug or alcohol addiction?
Well, because the implication would be that if that was really an issue, then perhaps it might relate to them as well. And frankly, they give alcoholics a bit of trouble too. So, you know, alcoholics don't have it quite as easy as we're making out. A lot of times there's a lot of social pressures on drinking as well. But with food, and particularly holiday food, people can't even conceive of giving up that short-term pleasure-seeking, self-indulgent behavior. Because what's the point of a holiday if you can't indulge in health-compromising behavior?
But
To
maybe
many people, that is the purpose of the holiday.
Right.
New Year's is about drinking till you can't remember what happened. And Thanksgiving is about eating so much that you can't move and having a bellyache afterwards. You know, that's what they associate the holiday about. It's not necessarily about social interaction. And frankly, if you came from some of their families where alcohol and alcohol abuse is a dominant factor, you might not feel so differently. But, you know, if you happen to be fortunate enough to have people you can interact with that are actually pleasant to be around, then you wouldn't feel a deficit because you had to maybe choose to eat less stimulating foods during that event.
Well, you know, there's other things you can celebrate, like being healthy and lean. You know, those are things to be thankful for. That's how I see. You brought up the concept of the intermittent fasting, the 5-2. So let me just read a few of the comments because they're interrelated. Mary says, how do we find out how to do the intermittent fasting that Dr. Goldhamer is talking about? And Kristen Bummer says, do you still consider the 5-2 fasting acceptable for people who tend to binge once they relapse? Because it is, after all, a form of restriction, and people in the food addiction community are taught to please not restrict, please not fast.
Sure. So you got to be careful, though, when we're talking about intermittent fasting. All we're doing is limiting the feeding window. So we have our breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but we start at a later time in the morning and we end dinner at earlier time. It might be, for example, we have breakfast at 9:30, we have dinner at 5, we don't eat after that. So we're still eating a normal feeding regime, but we're just doing it within a narrow window. We're eliminating the late night eating and things like that, which I think most groups would be supportive of.
Right.
Second of all, on the 5 and 2, you're not going on a fast in the sense that you're eating, frankly, probably more volume of food than most people eat during their normal feeding. You're just eating lower density food. You're eating a couple pounds of salad and a couple pounds of fruit. So you're still eating large volumes of food at your normal meal time. You're just reducing the density of the food. If it does not work for an individual, if that actually is a triggering mechanism for binging, then they can choose not to do it that way, do it a different way. But in my experience with people that do have these difficulties, they often find it's very helpful, not hurtful. And that 2 pounds of salad, 2 pounds of fruit does not result in inducing binging effects. And in fact, for many of those patients, they find it's a very helpful behavioral control mechanism in order to help them get to where good foods taste good again. So by going on a high volume, low density diet for a day or two, it oftentimes makes it so that then they're able to eat their normal plant-based SOS-free diet with relish.
Right.
So that's not been my experience. On the other hand, we recognize not everybody's the same. If it happens to be a trigger for an individual, that's fine. Come up with a different strategy.
Right. I love your idea of eating high volumes of low calorie dense food, but believe it or not, there's people, and not in a sense, generally not vegan, that say that's still not a good idea because we should, weigh and measure our food. We should, because overeating still triggers that dopamine or serotonin that people like that stretch, and that it's, I probably eat between 6 and 10 pounds of food a day, yet I'm lean. If I followed those weighing and measuring plans, I can't afford to lose any more weight. I'd starve.
I don't mind the idea of weighing and measuring on highly concentrated foods like nuts or seeds or something, but for the low density foods, there really is no, from my viewpoint, benefit of weighing and measuring those foods. We're trying to encourage large volumes of those foods so that the temptation to eat the more concentrated foods that you might want to be portion controlling is easier.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems counterproductive to me to weigh and measure the low density foods, because they're the very things that put us in a position where it's less difficult to avoid, say, over consuming those richer foods.
Well, I agree, but these food addiction programs say 7 ounces salad, 6 ounces of vegetables, and I'm like, I eat 4 pounds of vegetables in a sitting. I mean, how could I go that low?
I would absolutely not recommend you go that low. That's not going to work for you.
Right. Thank you.
What's going to work, or frankly, I think you have to remember that they're kind of falling in love with this concept that you can weigh and measure and through discipline control dietary intake. That's really not been shown for most populations to be effective. I would absolutely argue that for most people, including people with eating disorders, having a larger volume of low-density foods is going to have a net positive benefit in regulating the total caloric intake that they consume. And it's certainly going to help with nutritional balance in terms of getting vitamins, mineral fiber, etc.
Well, I absolutely agree. Mary says, for someone that has a lot of weight to lose, would intermittent fasting be a good idea to do on a regular basis, like once or twice a week?
Well, I think you're not really getting what we're talking about when we say intermittent fasting. The intermittent fasting, I'd recommend people go to our website at healthpromoting.com and read Dr. Morano's article.
And somebody, Yvonne, has kindly posted it. It's right here for our viewers to see.
It's really a comprehensive approach, which is 5 or 6 days a week, you're eating your 3 healthy meals of fruit, salad, steamed vegetables, potatoes, rice, and beans, whatever those ratios and proportions are appropriate to you. And 1 or 2 days a week, you reduce your caloric density to around 600 calories of fruit and salad material. There are different versions of this that people do, but the idea being to facilitate, to augment weight loss, to neuroadapt the palate. This can be a very, very effective strategy for people. Sometimes forget about the raw fruit and vegetable days. Just narrowing the feeding window is often very helpful at facilitating weight loss, and certainly less controversial in the sense that you're just eating your health-promoting diet, but just limiting the number of hours a day you feed. There's absolutely evidence that regardless of the diet you eat, healthy or not, people that narrow their feeding windows narrow their total caloric consumption.
Yeah, that would make sense. You mentioned about neuroadapting the palate. That seems to be a problem for a lot of people, and it seems very difficult for them to give up the high-fat foods, whether it's oil or nuts or peanut butter or tahini. It's hard for them to give up the salt and very hard for them to give up the sugar. Can you explain to them what neuroadaptation is and how there is a light at the end of the tunnel and how long it normally takes?
So there is a light at the end of the tunnel, but it is a bit of a long tunnel because, for example, once you're an addict and you're addicted to the artificial stimulation of, for example, added salt, it takes almost a month of a low-salt diet before people fully adapt to a low-salt diet. So during that month, they're often finding the food kind of tastes tasteless to them. They don't like it. But then slowly but surely, the palate comes alive, and you can once again taste whole natural foods. Now, with fasting, it happens much quicker, and that's one of the benefits of medically supervised water-only fasting is literally in a few days, people can actually start to taste the natural sodium, for example, in chard and vegetables, and things start to have more appeal. One of the ways I can tell a person needs to fast is the fact that they don't like the taste of whole natural foods. And, some people it takes a few days. Sometimes it actually takes a few weeks of fasting in order to get them to where they can choke down what starts out as tasteless swill and becomes quite good eventually. With fat, it's even more difficult because a high-fat diet When you go on a low-fat diet, at first your brain is saying, hey, we're not getting enough calories. We're starving. And literally, when you're losing fat, your brain is stimulating all kinds of neurochemistry to warn you that you are hemorrhaging strategic fat stores. Your brain is trying to get you to stop it. And you're thinking, well, I'm fat, I want to lose weight. But your brain is saying, hey, we need to store those fat stores so that when spring comes late, you survive. If you get skinny and spring comes late, you'll die. And so your brain is sending you life-threatening signals trying to get you to stop the hemorrhaging. And that takes about 3 months for people.
Wow.
To get to the point where a low-fat diet provides them the satiety that they need. And particularly if they're losing weight. Now, once you get to your optimum weight, all of this stuff gets a little bit easier. But as long as you're losing fat, your body and brain aren't going to be that happy about this process. And even with fasting, although most people, by the time they're done doing a proper fast, will enjoy the taste of whole foods, some people, it's actually the second fast before they can really relish whole natural foods. You know, sometimes people have spent their whole life engaging in this kind of salt, oil, sugar, animal food-based diets. And plus, they've got a lot of emotional overlays and psychological variables on top of it. And they've got all the social pressures. The truth is, I'm amazed that anybody ever makes this transition. I'm constantly impressed with how well people can do, considering what they're overcoming. And for some people, they're even more vulnerable than the average person. And they whether it's psychological or neurochemical, who knows? You know, we can argue that. But for example, some people have food triggers where, you know, a normal healthy food that somebody else might eat and not have any difficulty regulating, it has like a drug-like effect for them.
Mm-hmm. Well, Yvonne says that flour is her biggest trigger.
Well, any highly concentrated food, like a flour, a dried fruit, a juice, is going to have more of a tendency than would a whole natural food. That's why we talk about whole plant food diet. So we're not talking about potato flour. We're talking about steamed or baked potatoes. We're talking about salad, not necessarily emphasizing juicing, blending, processing, but as much as possible whole foods. And the process of eating whole foods, the chewing, the swallowing, the digestion, all of these factors play into helping our brains regulate appropriate quantitative intake. Mm-hmm. And so anytime you process the food, I don't care, even simple processing, you increase caloric density, you get to where there's a higher degree of vulnerability. Now, some people, like Dr. Lyle, you know, he's the kind of guy that he'd be eating cashews and he'd have 3.5. And then he'd be full, and he'd put the half a cashew down. And, you know,
you and me aren't like that.
I'm not like that either. I have to, like, literally, that's one of the foods I have to measure out. I would measure out my ounce of nuts, and I'd have to put the bag away, because if I leave the bag out, I would tend to want to eat more than what I should be eating. So I mean, I can certainly understand that. Yeah. Other people, it might be true with even less calorically dense foods. For example, flour products or pasta products. You know, maybe you make a rice pasta. Well, you know, if you're Dr. Lyle, you have your 3 tablespoons and you're full, and that's it. Whereas, you know, I would tend to eat whatever's put in front of me. So I tend to try to put in front of me the amount that I know is consistent with, you know, what's going to be functional.
I swear, Dr. Goldhamer, we're cut for the same cloth. We have 2 very similar questions from Tracy and Yvonne. Yvonne says, can you please talk about curing versus managing food addiction? And Tracy says, is it once a food addict, always a food addict, or is there a chance of getting over it if you are compliant long enough? So similar.
I don't really believe in the concept of cure. Not just, for example, I do not believe you can cure obesity. You can manage it, and you may be able to manage it successfully for your entire life. But if you go back to eating greasy, fatty, slimy, dead, decaying flesh, highly processed foods, you're going to get fat again. Now, it may not happen instantly, but it's going to happen. I don't think you can cure alcoholism. I think if you can manage it, and you may be able to live your life without drinking or even thinking too much about it eventually. But if you go back to drinking, it's not going to be long before you're sucked into the pleasure trap again. And I don't think you can cure eating disorders, but I do think you can manage them. And so I think that this idea of cure is a bit of a misnomer. The question is it easy or difficult to manage a particular condition? And I'd have to say that eating disorders are amongst the more difficult conditions to manage. Now, does it get easier to manage it as time goes on? Yes, I think it does. And like anything, the longer you do it, the better you get at it, the easier it's going to be in order to sustain your behaviors. Do you find it's easier, AJ, to maintain a health promoting diet today than it was some years ago?
Oh my gosh, the more years of it's like, so what do you call it, sobriety, recovery you have under your belt? Yeah, absolutely.
You get better at living a health promoting lifestyle as part of it. You get better at dealing with the energy vampires, the people that do what they do best, and that's try to make you sick and fat like they are, so by comparison, they don't have to feel so bad.
Right.
You get better at recognizing the things that might trigger you or get into trouble. You get better at coming up with ways of going along and getting along with otherwise very nice people, but just don't know about, the difficulties you're having.
Oh, wow.
So skill sets improve, experience improves, and also, frankly, the healthier you are, the easier it is to put up with whatever you have to put up with. Because you're not exhausted and on the edge every single minute. You got some energy, you can deal with it. They're upset. Okay, so they're upset. You'll try to deal. You make your best good faith effort to keep.
And I think once people get that calmness from eating a health promoting diet and they get to their slim ideal weight, which we have a question about, they don't want to jeopardize that as much, Sure,
you have more benefit and less pleasure. At first, it's all, price paying without a lot of benefit. But later, you've got something on the line. You got something to defend.
Yeah,
and so I think it does get easier if people can somehow survive through all the turmoil to get to where they want to be.
Which these next few weeks will be for most people. Even if you don't participate in the holidays, just walking outside, the traffic, that you can just feel the stress in the air.
Now, I want you to think about something, AJ. Now, the average person is going to gain 8 pounds of fat this year. Now, do you think the averages are going to go down tremendously this year for our society? No. Now, you're not going to gain any weight this holiday.
No.
I'm not going to gain any weight this holiday.
Right.
So who's going to be gaining the extra weight to keep the averages up if you and I aren't gaining any? And did you delegate that responsibility to somebody you know? Because, frankly, the averages aren't going down, so somebody's going to have to pay that price.
That is crazy. So Janice wants to know, how do you know when your body is at its optimum weight?
Well, remember, you don't, because optimum weight is going to vary depending on what percentage of body is fat and muscle, etc. For example, the same person could have a 20-pound variation in optimum weight, depending on how much muscle mass. If you want to spend your life in the gym and lifting and bulking, you could, especially as a male, but even as a female, you could be much bigger and heavier. You might look thinner because muscle is much denser. So you might, if somebody looked at you, they might say, oh, well, she's not weighed very much, but might have a much higher weight because of the higher percent of muscle mass that's maintained. Some people have higher bone density than others. Some people, particularly athletes, have higher glycogen loads, for example. So I think you have to be very careful with getting arbitrary scale weights. Now, you can do percent body fat calculations. There are some ways to go in there, but I don't think we should really be worrying about any of this. What we should be worrying about is how strictly can we stick to a health-promoting diet. And what's going to end up happening for most people is they will continue to slowly lose weight down to a point where they feel fabulous. For most people, most women have a pretty good idea where they feel best at. And hopefully it's not influenced too much by looking at heroin-addicted fashion magazine models where people are having, photoshopped pictures setting up some kind of artificial image. But rather, what most people would agree is a health-promoting proportion of waist-to-hips ratio, percent body fat, etc. So I hesitate to get into trying to give weight-height ratio numbers or BMIs or any of that kind of stuff. But if a person is concerned that they're under or overweight, it is possible to do calculations to provide them assurance that they haven't gotten too thin or they're not still containing health-compromising extra weight.
Great. Yeah, we agree with that. We're not into the number thing. Linda wants to know if you can fast somebody with type 1 diabetes.
We typically type 1 diabetes is a relative contraindication to fasting. And the reason is you need insulin in order to adapt to the fasting state. And it gets very tricky regulating insulin levels during water-only fasting. So although we have done it, we do it on rare occasion, it's almost always with complications. And so generally type 1 diabetics we manage with aggressive diet and lifestyle programs. It's slower, but it still works great. We get excellent insulin control, you get hemoglobin A1Cs into target. You find that they require less insulin and are much less brittle when they're doing the diet and exercise appropriately. Fortunately, most diabetics are actually type 2 diabetics. They do produce enough insulin. In fact, they produce more insulin, not less insulin. And their problem is insulin resistance, which is caused by the diet that makes them fat. And as soon as you change the diet that makes them fat to a diet that allows them to achieve optimum weight, insulin resistance begins to reverse and blood sugar levels begin to normalize. And if you want to speed that up, we use therapeutic water-only fasting in order to make that happen quicker.
Nice. Mary says she was recently diagnosed with lipedema, and this fat is supposed to be very resistant to diet. Have you found that an SOS-free diet can help someone lose lipidemic fat? She has been obese much of her life and is really hoping that this helps her.
Yeah, well, fat is always difficult, whether it's lipidemic fat or any source of fat. Some fat is more difficult than other sources of fat. Some people have more difficulty. Women, for example, have much more difficulty than men. Women are essentially energy-conserving fat storage devices because they have high degrees of estrogen, which is a fat storage hormone, compared to men with testosterone, which is a fat-burning hormone. So, and women that have hormonal-related issues, metabolic issues, they also have to work harder. But so far, I haven't found any woman that can't lose her fat and restore her health if she's willing to do the diet and lifestyle changes to the degree that's necessary. Now, sure, some people do have to work much harder than others, and it's much slower than others, but I haven't yet seen the person that can violate the laws of physics and thermodynamics and is incapable of achieving their desirable weights.
Excellent. Thank you. You know, Dr. Goldhamer, when somebody's in AA, they count how many days they've been sober. And then if they relapse on alcohol, they have to go back to day one, even if they had 10, 20, 30 years sobriety. Is that the same thing with neuroadaptation in regards to taste nerves? So like, for instance, if it takes 30 days to get off salt and 3 months to neuroadapt to a lower fat diet and you relapse, then the next day, is it like day one again, or with taste is this
that way? It doesn't work that way. In fact, that's the danger, is that some people can start varying and still maintain enjoyment of their food and still maintain their more or less behavior patterns. And it's over time that they slip and slide into deeper and deeper trouble. In fact, I often find people, a lot of times that'll happen to them, and then they'll get into a little trouble. We'll see them come to the center for a little reboot. They'll do a little fast and kind of to get back on track. So I do think it's dangerous. I kind of disagree with Dr. Lyle a little bit in this regard. For many people, it's so much easier to just have a straight and narrow, I do this, I don't do that, and toe the line, than it is to tease themselves. That it's just a lot less energetic to just do it right. For other people, they find they can make the occasional variation. It doesn't bother them, and God bless them, and if they can get away with it, great. For most people, though, I think that the less variation they introduce into diet, the happier and healthier they're going to be.
And
they have to decide for themselves what that degree is.
And I think it's easier when you do it your way.
There are people that will say, they feel so deprived because they never get to have A, B, or Z, that occasionally they have that little chunk of skunk or they have that piece of fish or whatever it is, and they don't think about it. They might not do it for it, but they feel like they got to participate. If that's their psychology and their experience is such that they don't get into trouble, I don't really care. As long as they have a good long-term outcome, whether they have the variation like Dr. Lyle talks about or not, whatever works for them is great. But you got to be honest with yourself. If you're the person that has a little piece of chocolate and then for a week you're not doing anything but thinking about chocolate, you got to decide, is that little bit of short-term pleasure-seeking self-indulgent behavior worth the consequence of spending the next week of your life having to deal with, all these thoughts and issues?
I can tell you it's not. Yvonne says she has a hard time moderating baked oatmeal, which is just oats, apple, banana, and water. Why would baked oatmeal trigger her? Corn tortillas are also difficult for her.
Yeah, okay. The reason is because they're increased caloric density. If she just eats plain oatmeal, it has a certain caloric density in effect. But as soon as you add the concentrated sugars and you dehydrate it, essentially, which is what baking is, it's just like dealing with flour products. You increase caloric density, it has a little bit bigger effect on the mechanisms in your brain, and she may not be ready to do those types of concentrated foods without getting into trouble. But I would venture that if she can have plain oatmeal, it may be a perfectly acceptable food. If she can't handle the increased concentration for now, maybe she ought to hold off on that.
Thank you. Kristen says, do you have any recommendation for thyroid nodules? Somebody's doctor saying they have to be removed if they get any bigger?
Okay, so what I would suggest is then the strategy is let's try to see if we can get them to get smaller so they aren't hacking away at them. We know that with some, thyroid nodules is a broad topic. There's a lot of things that can contribute. We know, for example, though, with some, particularly Hashimoto's thyroiditis and other thyroid-related problems, these are autoimmune-related phenomena where it's the body's immune system attacking itself. And one of the triggers for that is gluten, at least in some people. It turns out the HLA-DQ gene associated with Hashimoto's thyroiditis is the same gene associated with hypothyroidism. So, with gluten sensitivity. So we know that for some people, gluten is a autoimmune trigger. I believe that you'll find dairy products are also a trigger for some people. Getting rid of those factors in the diet and adopting a strictly plant-based SOS-free diet may be sufficient to begin to see reversal of these growths. If it's not, then a period of medically supervised water-only fasting is often successful in helping reverse this process, and that may be enough successful to avoid the need for surgery.
Nice. And we have a question about rheumatoid arthritis and water fasting. I'm sorry, I forgot who asks it. It's going so fast. But the question is does it work, water fasting, for rheumatoid arthritis?
What's exciting about rheumatoid arthritis is one of the few conditions that even in the medical literature, there's evidence that fasting is effective at reversing the objective and subjective symptoms associated with rheumatoid arthritis. The problem and benefit of rheumatoid arthritis is it's a very difficult, painful condition, oftentimes aggressively managed. You need to understand, in rheumatoid arthritis, it's the body's immune system attacking its own cells. So that joint deformity, that inflammation is caused by that patient's immune system attacking itself. So the way the medical profession manages it, they say, well, since your immune system is attacking yourself, we'll stop your immune system. We'll shut it down with prednisone and methotrexate, etc. And it's like a dream, because you have no pain. And then it becomes a nightmare, because it turns out you need your immune system. And when you shut the immune system down with prednisone and the like, eventually you fall apart. So our approach is, okay, your immune system is attacking yourself. Let's try to get rid of the gut leakage that's associated with your immune system being stimulated to attack itself. The thing that causes gut leakage are free radicals. So things like smoking and drinking and eating processed foods, especially heated fats. And the proteins that tend to stimulate the immune system tend to be things like gluten and dairy products, etc. So by radically changing the diet, allowing the gut to heal, getting rid of the triggers to begin with in the diet, oftentimes this condition can be managed, often very successfully. In order to get people off medications can be a little tricky. That's why it's great at the True North Health Center. We have medical doctors that aren't complete idiots, and they can help people wean down these medications, eliminate the need for the medications, and then stabilize. The problem is you have to stay with the diet. If you go back to eating the highly processed foods, the symptoms come back, because you're not curing rheumatoid arthritis, you're managing it. But instead of managing it with disease contributing, death-causing drugs, you're doing it by eating a health-promoting diet.
Thank you, Dr. Goldhamer. Julie wants to know, what percentage of fat do you recommend? She finds that if the fat percentage is higher, she'll do more salad as a result of high fat or higher fat salad dressings.
The diets that we recommend, typically the average diets will contain between 15 and 18% of calories from fat. And that would be a diet that would include, for example, up to an ounce of nuts or seeds a day and perhaps a little bit of avocado. It doesn't take very much of these concentrated foods to significantly increase the percentage of calories of fat in the diet. So we do portion control and limit those fats in those people that can eat those foods without it getting them into trouble. But what's nice about that, if you take an ounce of, say, nuts or seeds, and you divide that into 2 portions, and you blend that into a dressing, it goes a long way flavor-wise. Or if you take a half an avocado and you slice that into say a quarter avocado sliced into a dressing, again, you can get a lot of flavor for a relatively small amount of whole food-based fat-rich foods. And so I do think there's utility in including some of those richer foods in the diet for people that are able to handle that. Now, for people that are, say, actively trying to process weight loss, you want to be really careful with these foods because they are very rich. So, I think they can be used, but you have to use them with, great consciousness. It's very easy to overeat on fat-rich foods. And that's why I said, personally, I know myself, I don't have trouble with most foods, but I do with some foods like I mentioned raw cashews. And so I have to be very careful because even though I'm very experienced at this, it's very easy to eat a little bit more than what you know you're going to ultimately feel good with, the next day.
Yes, thank you. So Estelle wants to know, what is the least amount of time that an obese person can stay at True North and still be helped?
Well, actually, I've had people come in for a day, and just the process of getting an exam, just visually seeing what foods are supposed to look like and the volumes that people can eat, and then interacting with other people that were successful and had profound effects on them. So I don't think there is minimums and all that. I think that my goal with a patient is to get them healthy enough that they can be stable without the medications, because I find the medications are just devastating. So we like to have people, at least if we can get them off the drugs, and to where they get to the point where good foods taste good. So for some people, that's not very long, and other people, it'll be weeks or months, depending on their condition. The best, for me, the best patient is a patient that says, well, I'll come and decide how long I stay based on how I'm doing. And we make that really easy at True North Health because people can come as short or as long as they want. We just guess the longest they might be there. But if, let's say, they come for 4 weeks, but they decide they only need a week, well, they pay for a week. There's no penalty because they got well quicker or something like that. So we try to be really flexible and allow people to let their bodies decide how much time they need. But the goal is to get them clinically stable, enjoying good food, so that when they go home, they're going to be able to stick to a program and make us look good.
Thank you. They want to know, Mary wants to know if you treat fibromyalgia at True North.
We have a lot of patients that have been diagnosed with fibromyalgia. Unfortunately, fibromyalgia is kind of a broad diagnostic term. It's not one specific thing. So it's not easy to tell a patient, because of that diagnosis, how long they should fast or how long they're going to be and what their outcome is going to be. Some people, and you'll see these people on the internet, they talk about their experience in very positive terms, get well quickly. And then they assume because they were diagnosed as fibromyalgia, everybody else is going to get well quickly. But the people that are not getting well quickly, are still struggling, aren't necessarily the ones writing those stories. And so it can be very misleading when you look at positive stories on the internet, thinking everybody has positive stories. And fibromyalgia is a condition where there's a broad range of people's experience. Yes, some people do have those miraculous short-term turnarounds, and they're very gratifying. But other people have worked very diligently, and it can be very slow. Overall, it's a condition that does respond to healthful living, but it's not ever an easy, it's not like an easy condition to treat.
Thank you. Kristen and Tammy have similar questions. They've been following our way of eating for 3 years now. They've lost weight, maintained the healthy weight, but their LDL cholesterol went from 119 to 133. They don't eat nuts, seeds, or high-fat foods, haven't had animal products in years. So should they be worried when there's a slight rise in their cholesterol like that?
More concerned about what total cholesterol is than just the LDL alone. If total cholesterol remains in target, I wouldn't be as concerned. But if their total cholesterol is elevated and their LDL is elevated, I'd start to look at other things besides, if diet is already right, and that's, of course, taking that for granted, but let's assuming the diet is right, I would still look at things like sleep quality, because that can affect lipid levels, exercise integrity. That's a very important issue. If you want to shift LDL to HDL, one of the most effective ways to do that is to adopt a vigorous exercise program. We have a fitness trainer at our True North Health Center, David Goldman, who does a great job of helping people develop individual programs to meet them kind of where they're at. And most people's lipid levels do kind of come into target. The variation you're talking about, 119 to 139, is a pretty tight range for lipid levels, and there's lots of things, including total caloric intake, et cetera, that might have something to do with that. You also have to be careful with cholesterol, because when people are in active weight loss, sometimes their cholesterol levels will go up because they're literally mobilizing lipids out of their blood vessels, and there's no place for it to go except the bloodstream. So temporarily there may be a rise. Now, this is a long-term person. If they really have a question about that, one thing they could do is take advantage of True North Health Center's free phone consultative services. If they want to go on to our website at healthpromoting.com, fill out the registration form so I can review the medical history, email me copies of the Is that better?
Yes. Whew. I didn't know what you said because you were muted. Whew, thank goodness.
Okay, where did we get cut off?
That they can go to healthpromoting.com. They can fill out the health history form and partake of your generosity with a free consultation to see if True North would be right for them.
Right, or not if just if True North will be right, but perhaps there's some strategies we can share with them that they can try to adopt that might shift those numbers in the direction they're supposed to go. Like, for example, nag them about exercise, or look at the other.
Well, Gustavo says he wants to live at True North, as do I. People are loving your saying chunk of skunk. We're going to use that from now on. That's brilliant. I've known you a while. I haven't heard that. Julie wants to know if scleroderma can be treated with water fasting.
Water fasting is the treatment that we use with scleroderma. Again, autoimmune disease, very difficult condition, oftentimes aggressively treated medically, so you're dealing with the consequences of long-term medical treatment in many cases. But it is a condition that we've treated on numerous occasions, often quite successfully. In fact, sometimes it's really quite remarkable. One of the reasons I like autoimmune disease is because under conventional management, people never get well. You know, they tell you you'll be sick for the rest of your life until you die either from your disease or the consequences of its treatment. Whereas our results with autoimmune diseases is quite different. And I particularly like working with autoimmune patients because once they get well, they're totally stuck into the program. They have no choice because if they go back to eating health-compromising problems, they feel terrible.
Wow. A few brief food questions. How do you feel about certain foods like nutritional yeast, tahini, balsamic vinegar?
Balsamic vinegar, I like all vinegars. I don't mind, except that I think naturally there's some rumor that it tends to be higher in lead or something. And so I know we're buying vinegar from a place that's supposedly certified lead-free, whatever. But generally, I don't have a problem with vinegar if people don't have a problem with vinegar. Some people are.
Is it okay that we get those reduced ones that are a little bit more concentrated and sweet, but not from sugar?
I don't like the ones that have the flavored stuff because a lot of them have as much sugar as soda pop in them. So you got to be careful about those. But the rice vinegar, apple cider vinegar, balsamic vinegar, I think all can be used by significant numbers of people. Tahini is, if it's truly just sesame seeds ground up, would be treated just like any nut or seed. You limit your quantity, be careful about its use. We oftentimes do use sesame seeds as part of a dressing. We have a tahini citrus dressing that's very popular. And again, as long as you're able to control the quantity of that, I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. What was the other one?
Nutritional yeast.
You know, nutritional yeast is a highly concentrated food byproduct. For some people, it tends to lead to digestive challenges in terms of gas and other stuff, so people want to be careful with it. It's also very rich concentrated protein, so if it is used as a flavor enhancer, you know, because people put it on something or as part of a dressing or something and they enjoy that, I don't have a fundamental objection, but like any highly processed food, you want to use it with some caution and concern.
Thank you. How often, Kristen would like to know, do you recommend checking lipid panels?
Well, it depends. If a person has no cardiovascular history and no history of elevated lipids, I personally like to have my patients once a year. We do a yearly physical exam. We do a blood panel just to check, a little check-in, make sure everything is looking the way it's supposed to be. We check vitamin D. We check B12. And I think yearly for a healthy person, that's perfectly reasonable. However, if you have a person with cardiovascular disease and you're managing them actively, they're still losing weight, they're coming off medications, then that may need to be done more frequently. But that's an individual matter that the doctor they're working with at True North would help them talk about what a reasonable monitoring program might be for them.
Nice. Janice would like to know, does nightshade vegetables negatively affect osteoarthritis?
There are some people that are sensitive to the class of foods we talk about as nightshades, potatoes, tomatoes, etc. What I found is it's not a general rule. Most people with arthritis are perfectly fine having some fresh tomato or rotating potato in their diet. If a person is sensitive, no problem. We just avoid those foods from the diet. Some people, for example, might be able to have fresh tomatoes, but they don't do so well with tomato sauces or highly concentrated tomatoes. Like, for example, you might eat an orange and be fine, but if you have a glass of orange juice, which would have the equivalent of 6 oranges in it, you might notice some sensitivity.
Sure.
So some people might be able to have it once a week, but if they have it every single day, they may develop some difficulty. So again, this is an individual thing.
Clapper says the poison is in the dose. So Dr. Goldhamer, we're almost out of time. We thank you so much for your participation. Just like one or two brief final questions. I had the privilege of interviewing Dr. Lyle at Emory last week, and he said that you actually have a very unique personality that makes it quite easy for you to do this. And most of us don't have this personality. So any parting words of encouragement to just us regular folk with our regular brains that maybe suffer from food to navigate tomorrow's, feasts with food pushers, and we have a lot of women who are highly agreeable people pleasers. Can you just give us your best chunk of skunk to get us through this difficult holiday tomorrow and holiday season?
Well, I would say the most important advice is, number one, you don't want to go in biologically vulnerable, so don't go hungry. So maybe you have some food before you go. Have something that you take that's available, preferably for everybody, but whatever. And follow Dr. Lyle's advice about going along and getting along and how to manipulate other people's behavior so they don't bother you too much. Because for me, with my reptilian personality, I would find everybody being uncomfortable rather entertaining. And so it wouldn't really bother me too much. But if you're a normal person, that's not a comfortable feeling. And so I would defer to Dr. Lyle, who actually does know like how that stuff works and how people want to do it. I'm very fortunate. For the last 30 years, my holiday experience has been doing the cooking and the food serving and the dishwashing at the True North Health Center. Because during the holidays, the staff has those holidays off so they can be with their family, but we have 60 people to take care of. So my son and my wife and I come in and we do the staff's jobs on those days. And so I have no temptation at all because I'm busy doing the work that the staff does
Right.
on all the holiday days. So we basically just avoid them entirely.
Right. Well, I'm with you, Dr. Goldhamer. And if people want to avoid the holidays entirely, they should go to True North during the holidays. I believe the holiday extravaganza is sold out. If I'm not correct, there is a waiting list.
Yeah, apparently a lot of the people that listen to you have booked in because now all the beds are booked up. But for next year,
well, that's
we'll have
fantastic.
another
That's
holiday
fantastic.
extravaganza they can book in
It's
advance.
the safest place to be. Thank you so much, Dr. Goldhamer, for your time, your wisdom, for inspiring us, and for giving us a new phrase, chunk of skunk, and we're going to use that. And you have a happy, healthy Thanksgiving to you and to all of you watching and all of you watching on that replay. Just stay abstinent. It's so much easier to stay compliant than to keep neuroadapting and detoxifying and withdrawing and having to get compliant. You guys can do this. Stay strong. And thank you so much, Dr. Goldhamer. Thank you, Gustavo. And happy, healthy holidays to everyone.